The cup trembled in my hands as I watched my daughter-in-law's face drain of all color. Her scream still echoed through the breakfast room. "What did you do?" But let me tell you how this nightmare began, because what happened that morning in Burlington, Vermont would change everything I thought I knew about my own family. My name is Evelyn Turner. I'm 63 years old, and until that fateful morning, I believed I was living peacefully in my beautiful Victorian home on Church Street. After losing my dear husband Robert 2 years ago, I thought my biggest worry would be learning to live alone. How wrong I was. For the past 8 months, my son David and his wife Sarah had been staying with me. Initially, it was supposed to be temporary, just until they found their own place after David lost his job at the tech company. Sarah was 7 months pregnant with their first child, and I was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. I had opened my home and my heart to them, spending over $15,000 of my retirement savings to convert the guest wing into a comfortable apartment for the growing family. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The October leaves were painting Burlington in brilliant reds and golds, and I was humming softly while preparing for what should have been a joyous occasion, my granddaughter's baby shower, planned for the following weekend. I had already spent $3,200 on decorations, catering, and gifts, wanting everything to be perfect for Sarah and the baby. David had left early for a job interview, kissing my cheek and promising to be back by noon. Sarah emerged from their room looking radiant in her flowing maternity dress, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said with that smile, the one I would later recognize as something far more sinister than I could have imagined. "Let me make you some tea, dear," she offered, moving gracefully to the kitchen. "You've been doing so much for us. It's the least I can do." I settled into my favorite chair by the window, watching the morning joggers pass by on the tree-lined street. Sarah returned with an elegant tray bearing my grandmother's finest china tea set, the one I had inherited from my mother, worth over $2,000 and reserved for only the most special occasions. "I made your favorite chamomile blend," Sarah said, setting down 2 delicate cups. But something in her eyes made my blood run cold. There was a glint there, a satisfaction that seemed completely out of place for such a simple gesture. Her smile never wavered, but it felt wrong, like a mask poorly fitted to her face. As she handed me my cup, our fingers brushed, and I felt her hands trembling slightly. Not with nervousness or pregnancy fatigue, but with something else entirely, anticipation, perhaps even excitement. The fine hairs on my neck stood on end as every maternal instinct I possessed began screaming danger. "Thank you, sweetheart," I managed to say, accepting the cup while my mind raced. Why was she watching me so intently? Why did her breathing seem shallow, almost expectant? When Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, claiming the baby was pressing on her bladder, I seized my chance. My hands moved quickly and silently, switching my cup with the one meant for my son-in-law's father, Harold, who was due to arrive any moment for our weekly chess game. Something deep in my bones told me not to drink that tea. Minutes later, Harold knocked on the front door. Sarah returned from the bathroom just as I welcomed him in, her eyes immediately darting to the tea service. "Harold, perfect timing," I said warmly. Sarah made fresh tea. Without hesitation, Harold lifted what had originally been my cup and took a generous sip. "Delicious, Sarah. You're becoming quite the hostess." Then everything happened in slow motion. Harold's face contorted, his body began trembling violently, and he crashed to the floor, convulsing. Sarah's piercing scream shattered the morning silence. "What did you do?" I looked directly into her panicked eyes and replied with a calmness that surprised even me. "Your tea was delicious." The truth hit me like a lightning bolt. My daughter-in-law had just tried to poison me. If this story has gripped you as much as it's gripping me to tell it, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I need to share what happened next, and I'd love to know you're with me on this journey. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Knowing you're listening gives me strength to continue revealing the shocking truth about my family. The ambulance sirens wailed outside my Victorian home as paramedics worked frantically over Harold's convulsing body. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her pregnant belly heaving with panicked breaths, while I maintained an eerily calm exterior that masked the hurricane of betrayal raging inside me. "Mrs. Turner, we need to know exactly what he consumed," the lead paramedic demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. I handed him the delicate teacup, My grandmother's precious china now evidence in what could become a murder case. Sarah's face had transformed from the glowing, expectant mother I thought I knew into something unrecognizable. Her eyes darted between Harold's prone form and me, calculating, desperate. "It was just chamomile tea," she stammered. "I don't understand what's happening." But I understood perfectly. The woman I had welcomed into my home, supported with my life savings, and trusted with my son's happiness, had just attempted to murder me. The realization sent ice through my veins, even as my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "We need to talk." The paramedics lifted Harold onto a stretcher. His breathing stabilized, but his condition still critical. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, I caught Sarah's wrist gently but firmly. "Not here," I whispered. "Upstairs. Now." In my private sitting room, surrounded by 40 years of marriage photos and memories with Robert, I faced my daughter-in-law. The late morning sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting ethereal patterns across her guilt-stricken face. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, settling into Robert's reading chair. The leather still held his scent, and I drew strength from his presence. Sarah's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sank into the opposite chair, her hands protectively cradling her belly. "You don't understand, Evelyn. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you like my own mother." "Love?" The word tasted bitter. "Is that why you put poison in my tea?" "It wasn't supposed to be poison," she sobbed. "It was just supposed to make you sick, weak, so you'd need us more, so you'd change your will, so David and the baby would be secure." The confession hit me like a physical blow. "My will?" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "David doesn't know. He loves you so much, he'd never understand. But Evelyn, we're drowning in debt. The job he lost, he was embezzling money to pay for our fertility treatments. We owe $47,000 to the clinic and another $23,000 in credit card debt." My mind reeled. David, my principled son, who had inherited his father's moral compass, was a thief, and Sarah, sweet, vulnerable Sarah, was a would-be murderer. "The baby," I managed to say, looking at her rounded belly. "She's real," Sarah said quickly. "The pregnancy is real. That's why I'm so desperate. This little girl deserves better than parents who are criminals and debtors. She deserves your house, your savings, your legacy." I stood slowly, my 63-year-old bones feeling ancient under the weight of these revelations. "What exactly did you put in my tea?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Oleander extract. My grandmother used to grow them in Georgia. I researched the dosage. It was supposed to just cause heart palpitations, maybe a hospital stay, something that would make you realize how fragile you are, how much you need us here permanently." Oleander. The beautiful but deadly flowering shrub that tourists often admired in southern gardens, never knowing that every part of the plant contained cardiac glycosides potent enough to stop a heart. Sarah had literally been growing my death in her grandmother's garden knowledge. "And if I had died?" "You weren't supposed to die." Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. "I calculated everything. Your weight, your age, your heart medication. It was supposed to be just enough to scare you, not kill me outright," I finished. "Just slowly poison me into dependency." The sound of David's truck in the driveway made us both freeze. My son was home early from his interview, probably excited to share good news, completely unaware that his wife had just tried to murder his mother. Sarah grabbed my hands desperately. "Please, Evelyn, please don't tell him. Think about the baby. Think about David. This will destroy him." I looked into her tear-filled eyes and saw not remorse, but calculation. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was manipulating me, using my love for my son and unborn granddaughter as weapons against my better judgment. The front door slammed shut, and David's cheerful voice called up the stairs. "Mom! Sarah, I got the job. We're going to be okay." Little did my son know that okay was the last thing any of us would ever be again. David's footsteps thundered up the stairs, his voice bubbling with excitement that made my heart break before he even reached us. "Mom, you won't believe it. The interview went incredible, and they offered me the position on the spot, $65,000 a year plus benefits." He burst through the sitting room door, his face radiant with joy and relief, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between Sarah and me like electrical wire. In that moment, looking at my son's happiness, I understood the true cruelty of what Sarah had done. She hadn't just tried to poison my body, she had poisoned the very foundation of our family. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Sarah remained silent beside me, her hands still trembling in her lap. David's celebration faltered as he noticed our expressions. "What's wrong? You both look like someone died." The irony of his words wasn't lost on any of us. I stood slowly, every joint in my body protesting as if the weight of this knowledge had physically aged me. "David, we need to discuss something important. Please sit down." "Is it the baby?" he asked immediately, his eyes going to Sarah's belly. "Is everything okay with our daughter?" "The baby is fine," Sarah whispered, finally finding her voice. "David, Sarah tried to poison me this morning," I said simply. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then something approaching horror. "What? Mom, that's impossible. Sarah would never—" "She put oleander extract in my tea," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "If I hadn't switched cups with Harold, I would be the one in the hospital right now. Or worse." "Harold?" David spun toward Sarah. "Harold Wilson is in the hospital. What happened to Harold?" Sarah began crying again, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. We need the money so badly, and your mother has so much, and I thought—" "You thought what?" David's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You thought you'd poison my mother? It wasn't supposed to hurt her." Sarah's voice rose defensively. "It was just supposed to make her realize how much she needs us, how fragile life is. So she'd change her will, make sure the baby was provided for." David staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. "My God, Sarah. My God, what have you done?" I watched my son grapple with the destruction of everything he believed about his life, his wife, his future. In his face, I could see Robert's sense of right and wrong warring with his love for this woman who carried his child. "There's more, David," I said gently. Sarah shot me a pleading look, but I continued. "She told me about the debts, about why you really lost your job." The color drained from David's face entirely. He sank into the chair by the window, the same chair where I'd sat just hours earlier, innocently watching morning joggers while my daughter-in-law prepared my murder. "You told her?" he whispered to Sarah. "I had to. She would have found out anyway when the police—" Sarah caught herself, but it was too late. "Police?" David looked between us. "Sarah, are we talking about the police?" I took a deep breath. "Harold is in critical condition at the University of Vermont Medical Center. When they run their tests, they'll find oleander poisoning. There will be questions, investigations." David buried his face in his hands. $47,000 to the fertility clinic. $23,000 in credit cards, and now attempted murder. His voice was muffled, but clear. "My wife is going to prison, and I'm going to lose my job before I even start it because they'll run a background check and find the embezzlement." "David, no!" Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. "We can fix this. Your mother won't press charges. She loves us. She loves the baby." I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. "Don't use my love for my granddaughter as a shield for what you've done, Sarah." "Our granddaughter," Sarah corrected desperately. "She'll need her father. She'll need both her parents. Evelyn, please, think about what's best for the baby." David looked up at me with eyes that reminded me so painfully of Robert's. Honest, principled, broken. "Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I know what I did was wrong, and what Sarah did was unforgivable. But that little girl in there," he gestured toward Sarah's belly, "she's innocent in all this." The manipulation was breathtaking in its emotional precision. They were using my love for my unborn granddaughter, my dead husband's legacy, and my son's future as weapons to convince me to let attempted murder slide. But as I looked at David, really looked at him, I saw something else. Behind the desperation and guilt, there was relief. Relief that the secrets were finally out, that the lies had finally collapsed under their own weight. "What do you want me to do, David?" I asked quietly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the October afternoon that had started so peacefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I want you to do what Dad would have done. What's right. And in that moment, I knew that my son, despite everything, was still the man Robert and I had raised him to be. The University of Vermont Medical Center buzzed with afternoon activity as I made my way through the sterile corridors toward Harold's room. My hands clutched a small bouquet of flowers. Ironic, perhaps, given that flowers had nearly been the instrument of my death just hours earlier. Harold's wife, Margaret, sat beside his bed, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she held his hand. When she saw me, her eyes immediately filled with suspicion and confusion. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. How is he?" I asked, approaching the bed where Harold lay connected to various monitors. His face was pale but peaceful, his breathing steady thanks to the quick work of the paramedics. "Stable," Margaret replied. "But Evelyn, the doctors are saying some very strange things. They're talking about plant poisoning. Oleander. How is that even possible?" I sat heavily in the chair across from her, feeling every one of my 63 years. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be very difficult to hear." Over the next 20 minutes, I explained everything. Sarah's confession, the switched teacups, David's embezzlement, the desperate financial situation that had driven my daughter-in-law to attempted murder. Margaret's face went through the same progression of emotions I had witnessed in David: disbelief, horror, and finally, a cold anger. "That woman tried to kill you," Margaret said flatly. "And Harold nearly died because of it." "Yes. And you're here instead of at the police station because?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself during the drive to the hospital. "Because I needed to see Harold first. I needed to apologize to you both before I make any decisions about what comes next." Margaret leaned forward, her voice intense. "Evelyn Turner, you listen to me. Harold and I have been your friends for over 20 years. We've watched David grow up, celebrated his wedding, looked forward to meeting his child. But that woman," she spat the words, "that woman tried to murder you and nearly killed my husband in the process. There are no decisions to make here." A knock on the door interrupted us. Detective Lisa Martinez entered, her badge clearly visible on her jacket. "Mrs. Turner, I'm sorry to bother you, but we need to ask some questions about this morning's incident." My heart began racing. "Of course, Detective. The lab results came back on the tea sample you provided. We found significant levels of oleander extract, enough to cause serious cardiac distress or death, depending on the victim's size and health status." She glanced at Harold's still form. "Mr. Wilson is lucky to be alive." Margaret squeezed Harold's hand tighter. "Detective, Mrs. Turner was just telling me that her daughter-in-law admitted to poisoning the tea." Detective Martinez's eyebrows rose. "Is that correct, Mrs. Turner?" The moment had arrived, the point of no return where I would either protect my family or protect the law. I thought of Robert, of the moral compass he had instilled in both David and me. I thought of my unborn granddaughter, and what kind of world I wanted her to grow up in. "Yes," I said clearly. "Sarah Turner, my daughter-in-law, confessed to adding oleander extract to my tea this morning. She stated that her intention was to make me ill enough to become dependent on her and my son, with the ultimate goal of influencing me to change my will." Detective Martinez took careful notes. "And you switched cups with Mr. Wilson?" Something in her demeanor made me suspicious. When she left the room, I switched our cups. When Harold arrived and drank from what was originally my cup, he immediately became ill. "Where is Mrs. Sarah Turner now?" "At my home on Church Street with my son David." Detective Martinez closed her notebook. "Mrs. Turner, I'm going to need you to come to the station to give a formal statement, and I'll need to bring Mrs. Sarah Turner in for questioning." As we prepared to leave the hospital, Margaret caught my arm. "Evelyn, you're doing the right thing. That woman can't be allowed to get away with this just because she's pregnant." But as Detective Martinez and I walked toward the parking garage, I couldn't shake the image of David's broken face or the thought of my granddaughter being born while her mother sat in a jail cell. The detective seemed to sense my internal struggle. "Mrs. Turner, I know this is difficult. Family situations always are. But attempted murder is attempted murder, regardless of the family relationships involved." "I understand, Detective. It's just—" I paused, trying to find the words. "That baby she's carrying is innocent in all this." "Yes, she is," Detective Martinez agreed. "And that's exactly why it's important that she grows up in a world where actions have consequences, where right and wrong matter, where the people who love her most are willing to make hard choices to protect what's good and true. As we reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Mom, where are you? Sarah is having contractions. We might need to go to the hospital." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I was heading to the police station to press charges against a woman who might be giving birth to my granddaughter at any moment. But as I looked up at the hospital where Harold lay recovering from his wife's poisoning, I knew that Detective Martinez was right. Some things were more important than family loyalty. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Justice was one of them. The Burlington Police Department's interview room felt like a cage, its fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving as I recounted the morning's events for the third time. Detective Martinez's questions were thorough and professional, but I could see the disbelief in her eyes, not about Sarah's guilt, but about the sheer audacity of trying to poison your mother-in-law over breakfast. "Mrs. Turner, I need you to understand that once we file these charges, there's no going back," Detective Martinez said, her pen poised over the official complaint form. "Your daughter-in-law will be arrested for attempted murder and, given Mr. Wilson's condition, possibly additional charges for assault with a deadly weapon." My phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past hour, text after text from David about Sarah's worsening contractions. The last message read, "Mom, Sarah's water broke. We're heading to the hospital. Please, I need you here." "Detective," I said carefully, "if I sign this complaint right now, will you arrest her at the hospital while she's in labor?" "If necessary, yes, though we'd typically wait until after delivery if the suspect isn't considered a flight risk." I closed my eyes, imagining my granddaughter's first moments in this world, born into a reality where her mother was under arrest for attempted murder, where her father was a confessed embezzler, where her grandmother had chosen justice over family harmony. "There's something else you should know," I said quietly. "My son David admitted to embezzling money from his previous employer, $47,000 to pay for fertility treatments." Detective Martinez looked up sharply. "Is he willing to come forward about that?" "I believe so." He seemed relieved when the truth came out. As I signed the complaint, my hands trembling slightly, Detective Martinez received a call. "Martinez here." Her expression grew serious as she listened. "I understand. We'll be right there." She hung up and looked at me gravely. "Mrs. Turner, that was the hospital. Your daughter-in-law is in active labor, but there are complications. The stress and the oleander exposure may be affecting the baby. The doctors want to do an emergency cesarean section." The world tilted on its axis. "Is the baby okay?" "They don't know yet. Your son is requesting your presence, and given the circumstances, we're going to accompany you to the hospital. Mrs. Sarah Turner will be placed under arrest immediately following the delivery." The ride to the University of Vermont Medical Center passed in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. My mind raced between worry for my granddaughter's health and the crushing weight of what I had set in motion. By signing that complaint, I had potentially ensured that my granddaughter's first photograph would include a police officer in the background. David met us at the maternity ward entrance, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. "Mom, thank God you're here. They're taking Sarah into surgery now. The baby's heart rate is irregular. They think the stress of everything that happened might have affected her." "Where is Sarah now?" Detective Martinez asked, showing her badge to the nursing staff. "Operating room 3, David replied, then noticed the detective properly for the first time. "Why are there police here? Is this about Harold?" I took my son's hands in mine. "David, I filed charges against Sarah for attempted murder. Detective Martinez is here to arrest her after the baby is born." David staggered as if I'd struck him. "Mom, no. Please tell me you didn't. Not while she's giving birth to your granddaughter. Your wife tried to murder me this morning, David. Harold Wilson is in intensive care because of her actions. But the baby is innocent," I said firmly. "Which is exactly why she deserves to grow up knowing that her family believes in consequences for actions, in right and wrong, in justice." Dr. Rebecca Chen emerged from the operating room in scrubs, her mask pulled down around her neck. "Are you the Turner family?" "Yes," David and I said simultaneously. "The baby is stable. We delivered her by cesarean section, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, and healthy despite everything. However, Mrs. Turner is experiencing some cardiac irregularities that we believe are related to oleander exposure. She's stable, but we need to monitor her closely." Detective Martinez stepped forward. "Doctor, when will Mrs. Turner be able to have visitors?" She's sedated right now, but she should be conscious within the hour. Why do you ask? Police business. We'll need to speak with her as soon as she's medically able. David looked between the detective and me, his face crumbling. This is insane. My daughter is being born, and her mother is about to be arrested. How is this what's best for anyone? Dr. Chen frowned. I'm sorry, but did someone say arrested? I'm going to need to understand the situation here before I allow any police interaction with my patient. As Detective Martinez began explaining the circumstances to Dr. Chen, a nurse approached us. Mr. Turner, would you like to see your daughter? She's in the NICU for observation, but she's doing beautifully. David looked at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, will you come with me to meet your granddaughter? And so, 30 minutes after signing the complaint that would send the baby's mother to prison, I found myself standing in the NICU, looking down at the most beautiful child I had ever seen. She had David's dark hair and what appeared to be my husband Robert's strong chin. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my index finger with surprising strength. Hello, sweetheart, I whispered. I'm your grandmother, and I'm sorry the world you're being born into is so complicated. David stood beside me, his voice broken. Mom, look what we've done to her before she's even a day old. But as I gazed into my granddaughter's perfect face, I realized something crucial. I hadn't done this to her. Sarah's choices had done this to her. My choice was simply to ensure that she grew up in a world where those choices had meaning, where justice mattered, where love didn't excuse evil. What are you going to name her? I asked David. Grace, he said quietly. Her name is Grace Elizabeth Turner. Grace. It seemed fitting that a child born into such chaos would carry the name of divine forgiveness and blessing. Perhaps that was what we all needed now. Grace. Grace Elizabeth Turner slept peacefully in my arms while chaos erupted around us. Through the NICU window, I could see Detective Martinez speaking intensely with Dr. Chen, their conversation growing more animated by the minute. David paced the hallway like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to what I assumed was a lawyer. Mrs. Turner? A young nurse approached me carefully. I'm sorry to interrupt, but your daughter-in-law is awake and asking for you. I looked down at Grace, her tiny face serene in sleep, completely unaware that her world was about to shatter. David, I called softly. Sarah is awake. He ended his phone call and joined me. Mom, the lawyer says that if Sarah cooperates fully, confesses to everything, shows remorse, agrees to pay restitution to Harold's medical bills, there might be a possibility of a plea deal. Maybe house arrest instead of prison, especially given the baby. And what about your embezzlement charges? David's shoulders sagged. I'm turning myself in tomorrow morning. The lawyer thinks that with cooperation and restitution, I might get probation and community service instead of jail time. As we walked toward Sarah's recovery room, Detective Martinez intercepted us. Mrs. Turner, I need to inform you that we'll be reading Mrs. Sarah Turner her rights as soon as the doctor clears us to speak with her. Given the circumstances, we're allowing family members to be present, but anything said can and will be used in court. Sarah's room was dimly lit, machines beeping softly around her bed. She looked pale and fragile, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with perspiration. When she saw us enter, her eyes immediately went to the baby in my arms. Is she okay? Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from the surgery. She's perfect, I said, moving closer so Sarah could see her daughter. 6 pounds, 2 ounces. We've named her Grace. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she looked at her daughter. I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant— Mrs. Sarah Turner, Detective Martinez interrupted, stepping into the room with a uniformed officer. You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Evelyn Turner and the assault of Harold Wilson. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Sarah her rights, I watched my daughter-in-law's face crumble completely. The weight of her actions, the consequences of her desperation, the reality of what she had destroyed, it all crashed down on her at once. I want to confess, Sarah said suddenly, interrupting the Miranda warning. I want to tell you everything. Detective Martinez paused. Mrs. Turner, I strongly advise you to speak with an attorney before making any statements. No, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. I want my daughter to grow up knowing that her mother took responsibility for her actions. I want Evelyn to hear the whole truth. Over the next hour, Sarah laid out the entire conspiracy, the mounting debts from years of fertility treatments, David's desperate decision to embezzle funds from his employer when their insurance denied coverage, The growing panic as creditors began calling and threatening legal action. The sleepless nights planning how to secure their family's future. I researched Oleander for weeks, Sarah admitted, her voice steady now. I knew Evelyn took heart medication, so I calculated what I thought would be a non-lethal dose, just enough to cause heart palpitations and weakness. I wanted her to feel vulnerable, mortal. I thought if she had a health scare, she would realize how much she needed us here permanently. And changing her will? Detective Martinez asked. That was the ultimate goal. Evelyn has $180,000 in savings, plus this house worth nearly $400,000. With her gone, or if she became dependent on us, David and I could secure Grace's future. We could pay off our debts and give our daughter the life she deserved. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You researched how much money I have? Sarah couldn't meet my eyes. I found your financial statements when I was cleaning your study last month. I know about the life insurance payout from Robert's death, the retirement accounts, everything. The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined possible. This wasn't just about desperation or poor judgment. This was premeditated theft and murder, planned with the cold calculation of a master criminal. There's more, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been adding small amounts of oleander extract to your tea for the past 2 weeks. Tiny doses, just enough to make you feel weak and dizzy occasionally. I wanted you to think you were developing health problems naturally. The room fell silent, except for Grace's soft breathing and the steady beep of Sarah's monitors. I thought back over the past 2 weeks, the occasional dizziness I'd attributed to grief, the moments of weakness I'd blamed on my age, the times I'd felt my heart racing for no apparent reason. You've been slowly poisoning me for 2 weeks? I asked, my voice hollow. I'm sorry, Sarah sobbed. I'm so sorry. I love you, Evelyn. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to secure our family's future. David spoke for the first time since the confession began. Sarah, how could you? How could you poison my mother? How could you risk Grace's grandmother's life? Because I was desperate. Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. Because we owe over $70,000. Because you lost your job. Because I was terrified our daughter would grow up poor and ashamed like I did. Detective Martinez closed her notebook. Mrs. Turner, you'll be formally charged once you're medically cleared for transport. Given the severity of the charges and the evidence of premeditation, bail will likely be set quite high. As the police prepared to leave, Sarah looked at me with desperate eyes. Evelyn, please. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please don't let my mistakes destroy Grace's relationship with her father. David is a good man who made a terrible choice because he loves his family. I looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and then back at Sarah. That decision isn't mine to make anymore, Sarah. You've made choices that will affect Grace for the rest of her life. The best thing you can do now is take responsibility for them and try to minimize the damage. As we left Sarah's room, David walking beside me, in stunned silence, I realized that the woman who had given birth to my granddaughter just hours earlier was essentially a stranger. The Sarah I thought I knew, the loving, grateful daughter-in-law, had never existed at all. She had been a carefully constructed fiction, designed to gain my trust so she could more effectively plan my murder. 3 days after Grace's birth, I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the financial devastation that Sarah's confession had revealed. Thomas Brennan, my attorney for over 15 years, spread documents across his mahogany desk with the grim efficiency of a coroner laying out evidence. Evelyn, this is worse than we initially thought, Thomas said, adjusting his reading glasses. The identity theft charges alone are staggering. The papers before me told a story of systematic financial abuse that had been occurring under my own roof for months. Sarah hadn't just been planning to poison me, she had been systematically stealing from me, using my personal information to open credit accounts, take cash advances, and even forge my signature on several checks. How much? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. $34,000 in fraudulent charges across 6 different credit cards opened in your name. Another $12,000 in forged checks. And there's evidence she was planning to refinance your mortgage without your knowledge. The preliminary paperwork was already submitted to 3 different banks. I felt physically sick. $46,000, plus the interest and fees accumulating daily. The banks are treating this as identity theft, but until Sarah is convicted, you're technically liable for the debts. David, who had been sitting silently in the corner holding Grace, finally spoke. "Mom, I swear to you, I had no idea about any of this. I knew about our debts, but I never knew Sarah was stealing from you." Thomas consulted another document. "There's more, David. The investigation into your embezzlement has revealed that Sarah was pressuring you to take larger amounts. Text messages between you two show her pushing you to steal an additional $15,000 just last week." David's face went ashen. "She said it was just a loan, that we'd pay it back when I got a new job. A loan that you were stealing from your employer," Thomas said bluntly. "David, the prosecutor is considering upgrading your charges based on this evidence of ongoing conspiracy." The room fell silent, except for Grace's soft cooing. My granddaughter, innocent and perfect, was the only pure thing left in this mess of lies and crimes. "What are our options?" I asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "For you, we need to file formal complaints for identity theft and fraud, separate from the attempted murder charges. This will help with the banks and credit companies, but it means more legal proceedings. And for David, cooperation is his best option. Full restitution to his former employer, all $47,000, plus complete cooperation with authorities regarding Sarah's financial crimes. The prosecutor might consider a plea deal that keeps him out of prison." I looked at my son, holding his daughter with such tenderness despite the catastrophe surrounding them. "David, how do you propose to pay restitution of $47,000 when you just started a new job?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been thinking about that. The house that Sarah and I were looking at, we had put down a $5,000 deposit. I can get that back. I can sell my truck. It's worth about $12,000. And I was hoping," he looked up at me with desperate eyes, "I was hoping you might consider a loan for the rest, to be paid back over several years." The audacity of the request hit me like a slap. After everything that had happened, after his wife had tried to murder me and stolen nearly $50,000, my son was asking me to loan him money to pay for his crimes. "David," I said carefully, "you're asking me to financially enable the very behavior that led to this situation. I'm asking you to help me make things right," he said, tears flowing freely now. "I'm asking you to help me keep Grace's father out of prison." Thomas intervened. "Evelyn, there might be another option. Your homeowner's insurance includes identity theft protection with up to $50,000 in coverage. If you file claims for Sarah's fraudulent activities, the insurance company would handle restitution to the banks and credit card companies. And the embezzlement restitution? That would need to come from David. But Evelyn, I need to ask you something difficult. Your will currently leaves everything to David. Given these circumstances, have you considered making changes?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Change my will. Cut out my only child. Ensure that Grace's inheritance came directly to her, bypassing parents who had proven themselves to be criminals. "I've thought about it," I admitted. "But Thomas, if I change my will now, it looks vindictive, like I'm punishing David for Sarah's crimes." "Aren't you?" David asked quietly. "Mom, I know I made terrible choices. I know I broke the law and betrayed your trust, but I'm trying to make it right. I'm turning myself in. I'm cooperating with authorities. I'm doing everything I can to minimize the damage. Everything except taking full responsibility for the consequences," I replied. "You're asking me to bail you out, to make your problems disappear with my money." Grace began fussing in David's arms, her tiny cries filling the tension-heavy room. As David gently rocked her, I was struck by how natural he looked as a father, how much love radiated from him toward this innocent child. "Thomas," I said finally, "I want you to draft a new will. Everything goes into a trust for Grace, with very specific conditions. The trust pays for her health, education, and basic living expenses until she's 25. At that point, she inherits everything, but only if she has maintained good grades, stayed out of legal trouble, and completed either a college degree or trade certification." David looked up sharply. "And what about me?" "You inherit nothing," I said simply. "Your choices have consequences, David. Grace will be provided for, but your financial future is now your own responsibility." As Thomas began taking notes for the new will, David asked the question I'd been dreading. "What about Sarah? What happens to her now?" Through the office window, I could see the October leaves continuing their beautiful dance toward winter, completely indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Sarah will face trial for attempted murder, fraud, and identity theft. The prosecutor is seeking 8 to 12 years in prison. And Grace will grow up without her mother, Grace will grow up knowing that actions have consequences, I corrected. That might be the most valuable lesson we can give her. The Burlington County Courthouse buzzed with activity on the morning of Sarah's plea hearing. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside me, while David fidgeted nervously in the row behind. 6 weeks had passed since that terrible breakfast, and the weight of recent events had carved new lines into all our faces. Sarah entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her wrists shackled, looking nothing like the glowing pregnant woman who had served me poisoned tea. The transformation was startling. Her hair hung lank and unwashed, her face was gaunt from stress and poor eating, and her eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of sleepless nights and crushing guilt. Judge Patricia Hamilton presided with the stern demeanor of someone who had seen too many family tragedies played out in her courtroom. She reviewed the case file with methodical precision before addressing the packed courtroom. This case involves charges of attempted murder in the first degree, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement, Judge Hamilton announced. Mrs. Sarah Elizabeth Turner, how do you plead to the charge of attempted murder in the first degree? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Guilty, Your Honor. How do you plead to the charges of identity theft and wire fraud totaling $46,000? Guilty, Your Honor. How do you plead to conspiracy to commit embezzlement? Guilty, Your Honor. Judge Hamilton set down the file and looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Turner, do you understand that by pleading guilty to these charges, you are facing a potential sentence of 12 to 20 years in state prison? Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michelle Roberts, stood to address the court. Your Honor, while the defendant has entered guilty pleas and shown cooperation with our investigation, the premeditated nature of these crimes cannot be overlooked. Mrs. Turner spent weeks planning to poison her mother-in-law, researching dosages, and slowly administering sublethal amounts over a 2-week period. D.A. Roberts walked toward the jury box, her voice growing stronger. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated, cold-blooded attempted murder, coupled with systematic financial abuse of an elderly victim who had opened her home and her heart to the defendant. I felt Grace stir in her carrier, as if responding to the tension in the room. She opened her beautiful dark eyes, so much like her father's, and looked up at me with complete trust and innocence. Sarah's defense attorney, Robert Kimball, rose to present his client's case. Your Honor, my client stands before you today as a first-time offender who made terrible decisions born out of desperation and fear. She was facing crushing debt, an uncertain future for her unborn child, and the terror of homelessness. Mr. Kimball, Judge Hamilton interrupted, are you seriously suggesting that financial stress justifies attempted murder? No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that my client's mental state at the time of these crimes was severely compromised by pregnancy hormones, postpartum depression, and extreme financial anxiety. She was not thinking clearly. I couldn't remain silent any longer. Standing carefully so as not to disturb Grace, I requested permission to address the court. Your Honor, I am Evelyn Turner, the victim in this case. I would like to make a statement. Judge Hamilton nodded. You may proceed, Mrs. Turner. I looked across the courtroom at Sarah, who couldn't meet my eyes. Sarah Turner didn't just try to kill me. She systematically betrayed my trust, stole my identity, forged my signature, and planned my murder with the cold calculation of a professional criminal. She researched poison dosages. She tested sublethal amounts on me for weeks, watching me suffer from mysterious symptoms while pretending to care for my health. My voice grew stronger as I continued. She used my love for my son and my excitement about becoming a grandmother as weapons against me. She lived in my home, ate at my table, accepted my financial support, and repaid that kindness by plotting my death. Sarah began crying quietly, her shoulders shaking. However, I continued, I also want this court to know that I understand the impact of these proceedings on my granddaughter, Grace. She is innocent in all of this, and whatever sentence this court imposes will affect her life profoundly. Judge Hamilton leaned forward. What is your recommendation for sentencing, Mrs. Turner? The courtroom fell completely silent. David leaned forward in his seat. Harold and Margaret Wilson watched intently from across the aisle, and even the court reporter seemed to pause. Your Honor, I believe Sarah Turner should serve significant prison time for her crimes. However, I also believe that Grace deserves the opportunity to know her mother. I would support a sentence that allows for supervised visitation and the possibility of parole if Sarah demonstrates genuine rehabilitation and makes full financial restitution. D.A. Roberts looked surprised. Mrs. Turner, are you suggesting we reduce the charges? No, I said firmly. I'm suggesting that justice can include both punishment and the possibility of redemption. Sarah Turner committed serious crimes that could have killed me and did nearly kill Harold Wilson. She should face the full consequences of those actions, but Grace Turner deserves the chance to have a relationship with her mother, if her mother proves worthy of that privilege. Judge Hamilton made notes while I returned to my seat. Sarah's attorney requested a brief recess to consult with his client, and when court reconvened, Sarah stood to address the judge directly. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steadier than it had been all morning, "Mrs. Turner has shown me more grace and mercy than I deserve. I want to accept full responsibility for my crimes and work toward earning the privilege of being part of my daughter's life." Judge Hamilton was quiet for several minutes, reviewing documents and considering testimony. When she finally spoke, her words would determine the trajectory of Grace's childhood. "Mrs. Sarah Turner, I sentence you to 8 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years, contingent upon completion of rehabilitation programs, psychological counseling, and full financial restitution to all victims." The gavel fell with finality, echoing through the courtroom like a door slamming shut on one chapter of our lives and opening another. As they led Sarah away in shackles, she turned back to look at Grace one last time. In that moment, I saw not the calculated would-be murderer, but a broken young woman who had lost everything in her desperate attempt to secure her family's future. Grace slept through it all, unaware that her mother's fate had just been sealed. 5 months after Sarah's sentencing, I found myself establishing a routine that 6 months earlier would have seemed impossible. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I drove to the Chittenden County Correctional Facility with Grace for her supervised visits with Sarah. The baby was crawling now, her personality emerging more clearly each day. She had Robert's stubborn determination and David's gentle nature. David had received 2 years probation and 500 hours of community service for his embezzlement charges. He was working double shifts at his new job to pay restitution, living in a modest apartment across town, and seeing Grace every weekend. The financial stress had aged him, but I could see him slowly rebuilding his integrity, one honest paycheck at a time. "Mom, are you sure about this?" David asked as we prepared for another prison visit. He was adjusting Grace's car seat in my Honda, his movements careful and practiced. "You don't have to keep taking Grace to see Sarah. She won't remember these visits anyway." "But Sarah will," I replied, checking the diaper bag for the 3rd time. "And someday, when Grace is old enough to ask about her mother, I want to be able to tell her that we tried to maintain that connection." The drive to the correctional facility took 40 minutes through Vermont's stunning countryside. Grace babbled happily in her car seat, pointing at cows and horses with delight. She had no understanding of where we were going or why, which was perhaps a blessing. Sarah looked different each visit, sometimes healthier, sometimes more worn down by the realities of prison life. Today, as we sat in the sterile visiting room surrounded by other families navigating their own tragedies, she seemed stronger than I'd seen her in weeks. "Look at you, beautiful girl," Sarah cooed, as Grace crawled across the small play area designated for family visits. "You're getting so big," Grace responded with a huge smile and a stream of baby chatter that made Sarah laugh, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her since before the poisoning. "How are you doing, Sarah?" I asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair. "Better," she said, not taking her eyes off Grace. "I started the addiction counseling program, even though my addiction was to money and security rather than substances. And I'm working with a psychologist to understand how I justified what I did to myself. Any insights?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Grace pull herself up against a low table. "I think I convinced myself that you were just an obstacle to overcome rather than a person I was hurting. I dehumanized you in my mind so I could go through with the plan." The honesty was startling. "And now? Now I realize that I was so focused on giving Grace a secure future that I was willing to destroy the moral foundation that future should be built on." Sarah looked at me directly for the first time. "Evelyn, I robbed my daughter of her grandmother's life, her father's integrity, and her mother's freedom. I gave her financial security in exchange for everything that actually matters. Grace had found a soft toy and was examining it with the intense concentration that only babies possess. Watching her, I felt the familiar mixture of love and heartbreak that defined so much of my life now. "There's something I need to tell you," I said to Sarah. "I've changed my will. Everything goes into a trust for Grace now." Sarah nodded slowly. "David told me. I think it's the right decision." "Do you?" "Evelyn, David and I proved that we can't be trusted with money. We turned financial pressure into crimes. Grace deserves better than that." A guard announced that visiting time was ending in 5 minutes. Sarah scooped Grace up for one last cuddle, tears streaming down her face as she kissed her daughter's forehead. "I love you so much, baby girl," she whispered. "Mommy is going to work very hard to become someone worthy of your love." As we prepared to leave, Sarah caught my hand. "Evelyn, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider bringing Grace for Christmas? I know it's asking a lot." "We'll be here," I said simply. "Christmas Eve visiting hours, if they allow it." The drive home was quiet, except for Grace's contented babbling. She had no idea that the woman who held her so lovingly was serving 8 years for attempting to murder her grandmother. In Grace's world, these visits were simply time spent with another adult who adored her. That evening, as I gave Grace her bath in the kitchen sink, she was still small enough to fit comfortably. David arrived for dinner. He looked exhausted from his 12-hour shift at the warehouse, but his face lit up when he saw his daughter. "How was the visit?" he asked, lifting Grace from the sink and wrapping her in a soft towel. "Good. Sarah seems to be making genuine progress in her counseling." David was quiet as he dried Grace's hair. "Mom, do you ever regret pressing charges? Do you ever wonder if we could have handled this differently?" I considered the question while I prepared Grace's bottle. "I regret that it came to that point. I regret that your wife felt so desperate that she thought murder was a solution. I regret that Grace will grow up with this story as part of her family history. But do you regret turning Sarah in?" "No," I said firmly. "Because the alternative would have been teaching Grace that family loyalty trumps justice, that love excuses evil, that there are no real consequences for betraying trust. I couldn't give her that legacy." As David fed Grace her bottle, I watched them together, father and daughter, both innocent victims of Sarah's choices. David was working hard to rebuild his life, to become the man his daughter could be proud of. It wasn't easy, but it was honest work. "David," I said carefully, "I want you to know that while I can't trust you with money right now, I can see that you're working to become trustworthy again. That matters." He looked up with tears in his eyes. "It's going to take years to pay back the restitution and rebuild my credit. Years before I can afford a house where Grace can have her own room." "Good things are worth waiting for," I replied, "and Grace will benefit from seeing her father work hard and sacrifice to make things right." That night, after David had taken Grace home to his small apartment, I sat in my quiet house reading Robert's old letters. He had been gone over 2 years now, but his moral compass still guided our family's decisions. In one letter, written during his deployment overseas 40 years earlier, he had written, "Evelyn, I hope we raise children who understand that doing the right thing is often the hardest thing, but it's always worth it in the end." As I folded the letter and prepared for bed, I realized that despite all the pain and betrayal, we were succeeding in that goal. Grace would grow up understanding consequences, justice, and the difference between love and enabling. It wasn't the family story I had planned, but it was an honest one. 2 years after that poisoned breakfast changed our lives forever, I stood in my kitchen making tea, real tea, chamomile from a sealed box that I had opened myself, while Grace played with wooden blocks on the floor at my feet. At 18 months old, she was walking confidently and chattering in the mixed language of toddlers everywhere. "Gamma," she said, holding up a red block. "Gamma, look." "I see, sweetheart," I replied, marveling as always at how this beautiful child had emerged from such darkness. "That's a beautiful red block." David knocked on the kitchen door and entered with his usual Tuesday evening punctuality. He looked healthier than he had in months. The double shifts had ended when he received a promotion to shift supervisor, and the constant stress lines around his eyes had begun to fade. "How's my girl?" he asked, scooping Grace up for a kiss. She squealed with delight and immediately began babbling about her blocks, her books, and the cat she had seen in the garden. "We have some news," I told David as I poured tea for both of us. "Sarah called this morning. She's been approved for the work release program." David set Grace down carefully, his expression guarded. What does that mean? It means she can work at a job outside the prison during the day and return to the facility at night. It's a step toward eventual parole. Do you think she's ready for that? I had been asking myself the same question for weeks. Over the past 2 years, Sarah had completed every rehabilitation program available to her. She had earned her GED, completed a certification in bookkeeping, and attended both individual and group therapy sessions. Her letters to me had evolved from desperate apologies to thoughtful reflections on responsibility and redemption. I think she's trying, I said carefully. And I think Grace deserves to see her mother making that effort. David settled into the chair by the window, the same chair where I had sat that terrible morning, unaware that my breakfast companion was planning my murder. Mom, I need to tell you something. I've been offered a promotion at work, management track with a significant salary increase. That's wonderful, David. It would mean moving to their Burlington facility. I'd be able to afford a real house with a yard for Grace. Maybe even save for her college fund. I felt a flutter of anxiety. How far from here? 20 minutes. Not far. And Mom, he paused, looking down at Grace, who was now stacking blocks with intense concentration. I want to ask Sarah to marry me again. When she gets out. If she gets out. The statement hit me like cold water. David, are you certain about that? I know how it sounds. I know what she did was unforgivable. But Mom, she's the mother of my child. She's worked harder than anyone I know to understand and change what drove her to such desperation. And his voice cracked slightly, I still love her. Grace chose that moment to knock over her tower of blocks, clapping her hands at the crash and looking to us for approval of her demolition work. We both laughed, despite the heavy conversation, and I was reminded again of how children have the gift of bringing lightness to even the darkest moments. Have you told Sarah about your feelings? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. I know that given everything that happened, my judgment about Sarah might not be trustworthy. I considered his words carefully. David, I can't make this decision for you, but I can tell you that if you choose to rebuild your marriage, it will need to be on completely different terms. Sarah would need to prove not just that she's changed, but that she can be trusted with the responsibility of being Grace's mother. What would that look like to you? I had been thinking about this possibility for months, hoping it wouldn't come to pass, but preparing for it anyway. Complete financial transparency. All accounts, all spending, all decisions made jointly and with full disclosure. Regular counseling, both individual and couples. And David, if she ever gives me reason to doubt her again, I will not hesitate to act. Grace had abandoned her blocks and was now pulling herself up to stand beside my chair, reaching for my teacup with determined little hands. I lifted the cup safely out of reach and picked her up instead. Tell me about the work release program, David said. She would work at Burlington Accounting Services, entry-level bookkeeping, supervised housing at a halfway facility. Weekend visits with Grace would be allowed if she maintains good standing. And you're comfortable with that? I looked down at Grace, who had discovered the buttons on my cardigan and was examining them with fascination. I'm comfortable with the opportunity for Sarah to prove herself, but comfort and trust are different things. We were interrupted by the phone ringing. David answered while I entertained Grace, and from his side of the conversation, I could tell it was his probation officer. Yes, sir. Every month on schedule. Yes, the restitution payments are current. When he hung up, he looked relieved. 18 more months of probation, but they're pleased with my progress. How much is left on the restitution? $12,000. At my current payment rate, I'll have it paid off 6 months before my probation ends. As the evening continued, with Grace moving between playing, eating dinner, and eventually falling asleep in her father's arms, I reflected on how far we had all come. David had rebuilt his integrity one honest dollar at a time. I had learned to trust carefully, but not to close my heart completely. And Grace was growing up surrounded by love, even in the midst of our complicated circumstances. David, I said as he prepared to take Grace home for the night, whatever you decide about Sarah, remember that Grace will be watching. The choices we make now will teach her what love looks like, what forgiveness means, and what standards she should hold for herself and others. I know, Mom, and I promise you, Grace will never again be put in danger because of our poor choices. After they left, I sat in my quiet house with a cup of properly prepared tea, thinking about redemption and second chances. Sarah had tried to kill me. That fact would never change, but she was also Grace's mother, and she was working harder than anyone to earn the privilege of that title. Perhaps that was what Grace really meant, not the absence of consequences, but the possibility of earning your way back to love through genuine change and persistent effort. As I prepared for bed, I said a prayer for all of us, for Sarah in her cell, working toward a freedom she might not deserve, but was certainly earning, for David as he navigated the complex terrain of loving someone who had committed unforgivable acts, and for Grace, sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware that her family's story was one of the most profound examples of forgiveness and redemption I had ever witnessed. Tomorrow, I would make tea again, and the day after that. Each cup a small act of faith that life could be good and safe and normal, even after everything we had survived. The truth was, Sarah's tea had been bitter and poisonous, but the tea I made now, honest, simple, shared with people who had earned my trust through their actions rather than their words, was delicious. If this story has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of family drama, redemption, and the power of choosing justice over easy answers. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with viewers around the world who understand that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most meaningful outcomes.